Hey everyone, welcome back to Real Talk. This is a special episode on the stars. It's only our second episode of the kind. Previously, we discussed the tragic life of Bobby Driscoll, child star from Disney, who did not have the transition into an adulthood that one would like. Today, I want to shine a light on another life that was tragically cut short. Before we begin, a quick note. This episode discusses topics of domestic abuse, child abuse, and violence. Some listeners may find the content distressing. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, please reach out for help. In the U.S., you can call or text the National Child Abuse Hotline at 1-800-4-A-CHILD. That's 1-800-422-4453 for confidential support. You're not alone, and help is available. Now let's begin. Today, I want to talk about one of the most heartbreaking stories to come out of Hollywood, and one that affected me in my childhood. The life and tragic death of child actress Judith Barsi. Now, if you grew up in the mid to late 80s or even the early 90s, you might not immediately recognize her name, but I guarantee you've heard her voice. She was the little girl who played Ducky in The Land Before Time, the adorable little dinosaur who said, "Yep, yep, yep." Or maybe you remember her from All Dogs Go to Heaven, where she voiced Anne Marie. And for those of you who love a good, so bad it's good type of horror flick, she was also in Jaws: The Revenge. Judith seemed to have everything going for her. Talent, charisma, and a career that was just getting started. She could have been one of the biggest stars of her generation, but what most people don't know was that behind that bright, bubbly presence on screen, she was living a nightmare at home. Judith's father was abusive, violent, controlling. And despite multiple warning signs, despite people noticing that something wasn't right, no one stepped in soon enough to save her. This episode is a tough one. We're going to be discussing child abuse and domestic violence, so again, if that is something you are not comfortable hearing about, I totally understand, because listener discretion is advised. But I do think that Judith's story needs to be told over and over again. Not just because she was an incredibly talented young actress, but because what happened to her should never have happened. And it forces us to ask difficult questions. Who else besides her father holds responsibility for her death? Could someone, anyone, have stepped in and changed the course of her fate? We're going to take a look at her life, her career, and the warning signs that were ignored. Because while Judith Barsi's time in Hollywood was short, her story still matters. Let's get right into it. Background of Judith Barsi's parents. Like so many before them, Judith's parents, Joseph and Maria Barsi, came to the U.S. chasing the American dream. They were both Hungarian immigrants who had fled hardship, hoping for a fresh start in a country where anything seemed possible. But as we know, dreams don't always play out the way we hope, and in their case, that dream turned into something much darker. Maria was the kind of person who wasn't afraid to work hard to make things happen. She had big ambitions, not necessarily for herself, but for her daughter. The moment Judith showed even a hint of talent, Maria saw an opportunity. She worked multiple jobs to keep the family afloat. And when Judith's career took off, Maria was her biggest supporter, her manager, her advocate, and in many ways, she was the one who kept everything running. Joseph, on the other hand, was a completely different story. He had come to the U.S. looking for a better life. But unlike Maria, he struggled to build anything stable. He worked as a plumber, but his alcoholism made it difficult for him to hold down a steady job. More than that, he had a violent streak, and one that would only get worse over time. At first, things probably seemed fine. From the outside, the Barsi family looked like they had it all. A talented daughter landing acting roles, a mother who was making sure she had every opportunity to succeed, a father who, at least in public, was proud of her. But behind closed doors, a different picture was forming. Joseph couldn't handle his wife and daughter's success. His drinking got worse. His temper flared more often. And while Judith was bringing in money, giving the family financial security they had never had before, it only seemed to make him angrier. It was as if, instead of feeling proud of his daughter, he felt threatened by her, and resentment started to grow. Now, this wasn't the first time Joseph had acted violently. Even before Judith's career, there were warning signs. He had been abusive in previous relationships, and now that anger was turning toward Maria and Judith. Maria saw what was happening. She wasn't blind to it. She confided in friends, made reports to the police, even thought about leaving. But like so many people trapped in an abusive situation, she hesitated. Maybe she thought he would change. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she thought with Judith's career taking off, things would get better. But things didn't get better. They got worse. By the time Judith's career was in full swing, the tension in the household was unbearable. Maria was still pushing forward, trying to keep things together for Judith, but Joseph's behavior was becoming impossible to ignore. The cycle of abuse that had been simmering beneath the surface was now in full force. And the tragic thing? People saw it. There were signs, so many signs, yet nothing changed. It's easy to wonder, what if Maria had left sooner? What if someone had stepped in? What if the system had worked the way it was supposed to? But the truth is, abusive situations are complicated. And in the case of the Barsi family, it was a ticking time bomb that no one diffused. And then it was too late. The rise of a child star. So let's talk about the incredible talent that was Judith Barsi. It is easy now to look back at her work and see just how special she was. Her voice, her expressions, her ability to bring characters to life. But what makes her story even more heartbreaking is knowing that while the world saw this bubbly, gifted little girl, her home life was a completely different story. Judith's journey into Hollywood started in a pretty unexpected place, an ice rink. She was just 5 years old, skating like any other kid, when a talent scout noticed her. And really, how could they not? She had this spark, this energy that made her stand out, even in a crowd of children. Her mother, Maria, jumped on the opportunity. Maria always wanted a better life, and for her, Judith's talent was just the key to achieving that. She quickly got her into auditions, and it didn't take long for Judith to start booking gigs. Her first commercial was for Donald Duck orange juice. Just a cute little ad, but it kicked off what would be an insanely busy career. And when I say busy, I mean busy. By the time she was 6 or 7, she was appearing in dozens of commercials. Over 70, actually. And that's an insane number for anyone, let alone a kid who was just starting elementary school. If you watch TV in the mid-'80s, chances are you saw her face selling some kind of product. But it wasn't just commercials. She was landing roles on major TV shows as well. She popped up in an episode of Cheers, Growing Pains, and The Twilight Zone, and a bunch of other popular shows at the time. Directors and casting agents loved her. She was professional, charming, and most importantly, incredibly talented. And that talent led to some pretty iconic roles. Judith had a natural gift for voice acting. She landed what would become her most beloved roles, Ducky in Land Before Time. And if you've ever seen the movie, you know exactly how perfect she was. Her sweet little voice, her enthusiasm, it was all so genuine. And of course, the line we all remember, "Yep, yep, yep." That was all Judith. That wasn't in the script. She came up with that during recording. And the filmmakers, Don Bluth, loved it so much, they made it a part of Ducky's character. She also voiced Anne Marie in All Dogs Go to Heaven, another tear-jerking animated classic. And again, she brought so much warmth and heart to that role. Don Bluth, who directed both of those movies, later said that Judith had a gift. He called her astonishing, saying that she understood the emotions of her characters so well, especially for someone her age. He actually planned on making her the cornerstone of his voice acting stable for future endeavors. And let's not forget, she also made it to the big screen in live action. She had a starring role in Jaws: The Revenge, which I know is not exactly a great movie, but let's be real, that one's infamous for a reason. But Judith was still a standout in it. At just 10 years old, she had already built a career that some actors can only dream of. She was on her way to becoming one of the biggest child stars of her generation. But while Judith was bringing joy to audiences, things at home were getting darker. Success should have meant happiness for Judith and her family. They were making good money. Her commercials, TV work, and movie roles were all bringing in a very solid income. The Barsi family moved into a nice house in the San Fernando Valley, a place Maria had dreamed of owning. From the outside, it probably looked like they had made it. But inside that house, things were far from perfect. Her father, Joseph, didn't handle Judith's success well. In fact, as we mentioned, he resented it. Instead of being a proud father, he felt like he was being overshadowed. He wasn't the provider, his daughter was, and that ate away at him. Joseph had always been an angry, controlling man. He had a history of drinking and violence, even before Judith was born. But as she got more famous, his jealousy and rage got worse. He was unpredictable, and worse, he started making terrifying threats. He told Maria and Judith that he would kill them if they ever tried to leave. And he wasn't just saying it in anger, he made sure they believed him. He even started collecting gasoline in the garage, saying he'd set the house on fire if Maria tried to take Judith away. And Judith, despite being so young, started showing signs that the abuse was affecting her. Her co-workers later recalled that sometimes she seemed anxious or sad, and at home she was struggling. She started pulling out her own eyelashes and even plucking her cat's whiskers. These were clear signs of extreme anxiety, but no one outside the home really knew what was going on. Maria tried to protect Judith the best she could. She even reported the abuse to the police at one point. But here's the tragic part. When social workers visited, Maria downplayed how bad it was. She was scared. She knew that if she made Joseph angry, things could get even worse. So nothing changed. And while the world saw this rising child star, adored by audiences. No one could see the terrifying reality she was living in. Despite everything happening at home, Judith kept working. She was a pro. No one on set ever saw her break down or lose focus. Even when she was dealing with fear and stress at home, she would show up to work with that same bright smile. In fact, All Dogs Go to Heaven was supposed to be her next big step. Judith's performance as Anne-Marie was incredible. She had the ability to bring so much heart and emotion to the role. Don Bluth believed she had a long and successful career ahead of her. And as I mentioned, he had plans to cast her in his future projects. The sky was the limit. But as Judith's career reached new heights, the danger at home became impossible to ignore. And just a few months after she finished recording for All Dogs Go to Heaven, her life was tragically cut short. At this point in the story, we all know what's coming next. But every time I think about Judith's story, I can't help but wonder, why didn't someone step in? Was there anything more that could be done? Because while Joseph is the one who ultimately took Judith's life, he wasn't the only one that failed her. There were warning signs. People knew something wasn't right, and yet no one intervened in time. In this next section, we'll talk about those warning signs. What people saw, what was reported, and what was missed before everything came to the tragic end. Signs of trouble. At first glance, Judith Barsi seemed like any other successful child star. She was bubbly, talented, and completely natural in front of the camera. But as time went on, the people around her started noticing that something wasn't quite right. She was becoming more withdrawn, more anxious. Her usual bright energy would flicker in and out, replaced by sudden mood swings and outbursts of emotion. She was just a little girl, but she was carrying something heavy, something no child should have to bear. Even on set, where she should have felt safe, the cracks were showing. One director later recalled, she was still that talented, bright little girl, but there was something else, something sad behind her eyes. Her co-stars and crew members saw it as well. There were days when she would suddenly break down in tears, seemingly out of nowhere. Other times, she'd become uncharacteristically quiet, like she was lost in thought, or worse, lost in fear. It wasn't just subtle changes in her behavior. Judith was physically manifesting the trauma she was enduring at home. I mentioned pulling out her eyelashes, then her eyebrows, and eventually, in an especially heartbreaking sign of distress, she began plucking out the whiskers of her beloved cat. Experts now recognize these all as classic signs of extreme anxiety, desperate attempts to exert control over something in an environment where control doesn't exist. Her mother, Maria, knew things were getting worse. She was living in the same house, after all, and she saw it firsthand. She knew that Joseph was dangerous, that his drinking was spiraling, and that his threats were becoming more and more real. She tried to get help. She confided in friends. She called the police. She even reported the abuse to social services. And yet, nothing changed. Social workers did visit the Barsi home at one point, but when they did, Maria, out of fear, downplayed it all. Maybe she was afraid of Joseph. Maybe she was afraid of what he would do if he found out she had spoken up. Maybe she believed on some level that things could still get better, but they didn't. The abuse continued unchecked, and every time someone ignored the red flags, every time an opportunity to help Judith slipped away, her fate became more and more sealed. Looking back now, it's gut-wrenching to think of all the moments when someone could have stepped in, when the system should have worked, but didn't. The signs were always there. They were bright, flashing warning signals. And yet, Judith was left to suffer in silence. The system failed her again and again until it was too late. The tragic end. It all came to a horrifying end on July 25th, 1988. For years, Judith Barsi had been making violent threats, telling anyone who would listen that he would kill his wife and daughter if they ever tried to leave him. People heard him say it, Maria, friends, even neighbors. But so many brushed it off as drunken rambling, never truly believing he would follow through. That night, though, he did. Inside their San Fernando Valley home, as Judith slept in her bed, Joseph took a gun and shot his 10-year-old daughter in the head. Maria, who had likely woken to the sound of the gunshot, was next. Joseph turned the gun on her in the hallway, ending her life before she could do anything to protect her child. For 2 days, their bodies remained in the house as Joseph wandered the home, drinking and stewing in what he had done. At some point, he poured gasoline over the bodies, striking a match and setting his family home and his own past on fire. Then, as the flames engulfed the house, he walked to the garage, put the gun to his own head, and pulled the trigger. When police arrived, the scene was beyond devastating. Firefighters had managed to put out the flames, but the damage had already been done. The bodies of Maria and Judith were found, burned, their lives stolen in a way that was as cruel as it was preventable. Joseph's body was found in the garage, his final act of violence turned inward. News of Judith's death spread quickly, and the reaction was immediate. The Hollywood community was in shock. How could something like this happen? How could someone so full of life, so brimming with talent and possibility, be gone just like that? For many, the grief was compounded by guilt. Some had seen the signs. Some had even tried to help, but it hadn't been enough. Judith's final film, All Dogs Go to Heaven, was released a little over a year after her death. If you've seen it, you might remember the scene where her character, Anne Marie, says, "Goodbye, Charlie, I'll miss you." Many who worked on the film later admitted they couldn't watch that scene without tearing up, knowing the tragedy behind those words. Judith Barsi's story is heartbreaking, not just because of how she died, but because of how preventable it was. She was a little girl who should have had years ahead of her. More movies, more laughter, more time. Instead, her life was cut short by a man who was supposed to love and protect her. Even today, decades later, her story lingers. Her voice still echoes in classic animated films, and her memory serves as a painful reminder of what happens when warning signs are ignored. Reflection and responsibility. Judith's murder wasn't just the act of one violent man, it was a failure on multiple levels. And that's one of the hardest parts of this story. It wasn't like no one saw what was happening. There were so many warning signs, so many red flags. People knew. They saw the bruises, they heard the crying. They watched as this bright little girl slowly became more withdrawn, more anxious, and yet nothing changed. So the question we have to ask, who else is responsible for Judith Barsi's death? Could her story have had a different ending if someone, anyone, had stepped up in a bigger way? Well, let's start with the police and social services, because Maria actually did report the abuse. She reached out. She told authorities that her husband was violent, that he was dangerous, that he was making threats. And yet, Judith was never taken out of that house. There are reports that social workers even visited the Barsi home at one point. They saw Judith. They talked to Maria. But when they asked her about the abuse, it was downplayed. They were told everything was fine and things had calmed down. So they just left. Now, it's easy to look at this and think, how could they just walk away? How could they not see what was happening? But the unfortunate reality is, back in the 80s, domestic violence cases weren't handled the way they are now. There wasn't as much urgency in these situations. The system wasn't built to immediately remove children unless there was undeniable physical proof of danger. And even today, as much as we like to think we've improved, we still see cases where social services don't intervene soon enough. But Judith was showing those signs of distress, the pulling out of her eyelashes, picking at her skin, clear signs of severe anxiety. Someone should have connected the dots. And yet she was left in that home, in that nightmare, until it was too late. So should the system have stepped in earlier? Absolutely. Would it have saved her life? It's impossible to say for sure, but we can't ignore the fact that the opportunity was there and it was missed. Then there's the people in Hollywood, agents, producers, directors, and the other actors. The people who worked with Judith day in and day out. They saw her on set. They interacted with her. And many of them noticed that something was wrong. One director even recalled that there was sadness behind her eyes. A friend of Maria's remembered how Judith started talking about how her father would hit her. And yet, despite these warning signs, no one took that extra step to make sure she was truly safe. Now, to be fair, Hollywood is a tough industry, especially when it comes to child actors. People in the business see a lot of kids struggling with pressure, stress from auditions, demanding parents, long hours on set. Sometimes it is hard to tell the difference between a kid who's just overwhelmed and a kid who is in danger. But here's the thing. There were multiple people who knew for a fact that Judith was being abused. Her agent knew. Friends of the family knew. Her mother knew. And yet the momentum wasn't there to actually pull her out of the situation. Should her agent have gone to the police? Should a director or producer have said, enough is enough, this girl needs help? It's painful to think about, but it's a question that has to be asked. And then there's Maria herself. This is one of the most difficult aspects of the story because Maria was a victim too. She was living in constant fear, threatened, controlled by Joseph. And anyone who experienced domestic abuse knows it's not as simple as just packing a bag and leaving. Abusers manipulate, they isolate, and they create a world where their victims feel trapped. But at the same time, Maria had options. She was financially stable because of Judith's success. She could have left. In fact, she planned to leave. She had even rented an apartment where she and Judith were supposed to move. But for some reason, she hesitated. Some say she was afraid he would follow her, and then he would kill them if she tried to escape. And tragically, that's exactly what ended up happening anyway. So what do we do with that? Do we hold Maria responsible for not leaving when she had the chance? Or do we recognize that she too was a victim of a cycle of abuse, one that made her believe there was no way out? There are no easy answers here, but what we do know is that fear kept Maria frozen, and that fear ultimately cost her and her daughter's lives. Judith's case became one of the most infamous examples of how easily children can fall through the cracks. Her story has since been used in discussions about proving child welfare laws and especially protections for young actors in Hollywood. And while there have been improvements, stories like Judith still happen today. Child actors still face dangerous situations behind the scenes. Domestic abuse victims still struggle to find a way out. And social services, despite all the changes, still sometimes fail to intervene when they should. So as we wrap up this discussion, I want to turn this question over to you, my listeners. Who else, besides Judith Barsi, bears responsibility for Judith's death? Should the system have stepped in sooner? Should Hollywood professionals have done more? And what can we as a society do to make sure that stories like this don't happen again? Reach out on social media, send in your thoughts, and let's continue the conversation. Because if there is one thing we owe Judith, it's to learn from what happened to her and make sure that no other child, not just child star, no other child is left unheard. Some closing thoughts. And I apologize now if this is a little redundant, but I feel it is all worth saying again. Judith's life was far too short, but her work still resonates. Every time a child or the child within us watches The Land Before Time and smiles at Ducky's innocent joy, a little piece of Judith lives on. Her voice, so full of life, warmth, and playfulness, continues to touch lives of people who have no idea about the heartbreaking story behind it. That is the cruel irony of it all. She brought happiness to so many while enduring a nightmare at home. Her story is tragic, but it's also infuriating because this didn't come out of nowhere. The warning signs were flashing, they were bright. People saw them, people heard them, and yet Judith was still trapped in that house with a man who had been making threats for years, threats he eventually followed through on. Now let me be very clear. There is no question about who is to blame for what happened. Judith Barsi murdered his daughter and his wife. He is the villain of this story, full stop. But the question I keep coming back to is, could someone, anyone, have stopped this? Could a single action, a different decision, have saved Judith and Maria's lives? I'm not saying I have the answers. I'm just asking the questions. And Maria was a victim too. Domestic abuse is a cycle of fear, control, and manipulation that is incredibly hard to escape. But at the same time, she did know how dangerous her husband was. She told her friends she was planning to leave. She even reached out to authorities at one point, But in the end, she stayed. And that decision ultimately cost them their lives. Could she have gotten out sooner? Could she have been given more support, more real, actionable help to escape before it was too late? Then there are the professionals who worked with Judith, the casting directors, the agents, the directors and producers, and the other actors. A few of them suspected something was wrong. Some even said something, but it wasn't enough. Could they have pushed harder? Or was it easier for the industry to look the other way? This was the late 80s, a time when child actors were making big money for studios. And let's be honest, Hollywood has never had the best track record when it comes to protecting kids. And what about social services? They actually visited the Barsi home. Judith was in their system. She had visible signs of distress. Her eyelashes harming, showing clear signs of anxiety. But for some reason, whatever reason, they didn't step in. Was it bureaucratic failure? Lack of resources? Or was it just one more case of a child slipping through the cracks? These are tough questions and they don't have easy answers, but I think they need to be asked. Because Judith's story isn't just a Hollywood tragedy. It's a real world failure. And it forces us to think about all the other kids out there right now who are in this same situation. Kids who might not have the fame or visibility that Judith did, but who are just as vulnerable and just as deserving of help. If there's any good to come from telling this story, it's this. We cannot ignore these warning signs. We cannot assume someone else will step in. And if you or someone you know is in an abusive situation, please reach out for help. There are resources. There are people who will listen, and no one should ever suffer in silence. Judith Barsi should have had the chance to grow up, to see what kind of actress, artist, or person she would become. She should have the chance to live. And with that, I'm just going to thank you for listening to Real Talk. If you have any thoughts on today's episode, reach out on social media, Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at Real Talk. Email at therealrealtalk@gmail.com, and let's keep this conversation going. Next time I do one of these episodes, we'll look at another star who left us too soon. Emotionally, these are very difficult for me, so they're not as often. But stay tuned. Until then, enjoy our breakdown of women directors and coming-of-age films. And until next time, hug someone you love. Keep your eyes open and don't let people suffer in silence. Thank you.
Underneath the sun's green gleam, talking reels and all their schemes, dusty scenes and dreams unfold, stories told in shadows bold, gritty plots and whispers tight, dim the streets in moonlight bright. We dissect the cinematic art, real by real we pull apart. The real talk where voices play with velvet words and starlit sway, reviewing tales both light and dark, classic films that leave a mark, dive deep in